Welcome back, guys. I hope you've practiced your freestanding handstands, because today we are going to take it one step farther and build towards the press into the handstand. The press to handstand is by far the most challenging inversion type we are going to learn in this program, because it requires so many elements to come together. But fear not, as you know, we are going to break it down into its individual components and build tools to help us work on each component individually. Then we are going to put everything back together and gradually build our way up into the press to handstand. By the end of this subsection, you will have the knowledge of the requirements for the press into the handstands, develop tools we can use to work on the requirements, technical knowledge of the elements of the press to handstand, awareness of the alignment process and common mistakes, methods we can use to build strength for the press to handstand, including a press to handstand specific training program, ways in which we can track and measure our progress for each element of the press to handstand, and of course ability to perform multiple variations of the press to handstand all the way up to the pike press into the handstand. Let's get upside down. Kicking off the session, we are going to introduce the requirements for the press to handstand, which include wrist strength and mobility, upper body strength, shoulder openness, compression, flexibility, core and hip flexor strength, and alignment. Let's start by examining the mechanics of the press into handstand. There are a number of primary isolated constituent movements to a press. We have shoulder flexion, which is lifting the arms overhead, scapula engagement, which is elevation of the shoulder blades, compression, consisting mostly of hip flexion, which is pushing the legs into the body, flexibility, core and shoulders, spinal flexion, the rounding of the spine, followed by spinal extension, the straightening of the spine. The press into handstand is an integration of all these primary movements, which, when executed together, put a lot of pressure on the wrists. Hence why we have a dedicated section on the wrists in the foundation section of this program. Lifting higher in the press causes the center of mass to rise, making it more challenging to hold the balance. So having solid freestanding handstand foundations is a must for learning the press, as opposed to the freestanding handstand, which is simply holding the body in a straight line. The handstand press is a function of both alignment and the press, which itself represents the capability to integrate the primary isolated constituent movements. Earlier in the session, we have defined the tools that will help us work on each individual component. These components are superimposed to construct the isolated primary movements, which in turn can work together to press into the handstand. Depending on your strengths and weaknesses, you may lack in certain components and be stronger in others. Typically, those who train calisthenics have great upper body strength but lack in flexibility and hip flexion. On the other side, yogis will have an abundance of flexibility but lack in upper body strength, and generally both will be lacking in hip flexion unless trained specifically, even though yogis may have a slight advantage. Even though a handstand press requires a good level for each of the identified components, it is possible to draw on your strengths and still do a press by compensating your weaknesses with your strength. That being said, there is a level of trade-off between these components. Let's pay attention to the angle in the shoulders and hips here. Generally, the less flexibility one has, the more they have to compensate with upper body strength by leaning forward. To understand this better, let's consider the mechanics of the press into handstand. As we have already seen, the center of mass must be within the balance space to enable us to press into the handstand in the first place. This is a requirement that we must meet, and we can visualize the need for this by drawing this imaginary line as shown here. If we were to come into a straight line with the center of mass where it is now, we would be inclined at an angle and end up falling back down. Now, when we go into the starting position of a press to handstand or a freestanding handstand, our center of mass will be farther away from the balance space, which is why we must lean forward until the center of mass comes within the balance boundaries. So I hope this gives you an intuitive understanding of this requirement. When it comes to the power required for the press to handstand, it can be divided into two parts. The first part is the vertical force component. This is embodied by Newton's second law, which states that the force is proportional to what is required for an object of constant mass to change its velocity. In the press to handstand, this is equal to our own body weight multiplied by acceleration, which in our case is the gravitational constant pulling us down towards the ground. We must exert a counterforce at least equal to the vertical force pulling us down in order to press into the handstand. The second part is the horizontal force component, which is proportional to the triangle area under our body as a fraction of our own body weight. The horizontal force component can be thought of in two parts itself. The first one is the FH, which represents the force required due to a limitation in hamstring flexibility. Less hamstring flexibility means the feet are farther apart from the wrists, increasing the triangle area and making it more challenging to press into the handstand. In this illustration, we started with a triangle area, a very geometric area shape, simply to illustrate the concept and make it understandable. In reality, however, this area shape is not as simple because we have another limiting factor, and namely shoulder mobility. So far, we have assumed that we have great shoulder mobility, allowing us to maintain 180 degrees shoulder openness while being upside down under tension. In practice, most likely this is not going to be the case unless you happen to have fantastic shoulder mobility, and also due to the fact that there will be a certain level of forward lean required to bring the hips on top of the shoulders. This will reduce the delta, which is a measure of this forward lean required, by bringing the center of mass within the balance boundaries. Both of these will deform our initial triangle area, introducing yet another area. So now we have an extra force area to account for, denoted as FSH, where SH stands for shoulders, as is due mainly for the limitations in the shoulders. In terms of formulas, this new area turns out to be about 1/4 of the original triangle area. Just a quick reminder that if you do like this type of content, then do show your support and subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything, and it lets me know it's something that provides value to you and that I should keep doing it. So what does this all mean for us? I don't want you to get stuck on any of these formulas, as we have briefly covered them here, simply for acquiring an intuition of the mechanics of the press, and most importantly, that the strength required for the press into handstand is a function of compression, which determines the area underneath us, which itself is largely a function of hamstring flexibility and shoulder mobility. In short, if we consider the area under this curve to be the energy expenditure, the bigger the area, the greater the variance from the center of mass, and hence the less efficient the movement is going to be, as it is mechanically not very advantageous and will require a lot more work. On the other hand, having good hip flexion and flexibility allows to keep more compact, decreasing the strength requirements and energy expenditure. As we minimize the area by compressing everything closer together, the variance decreases, bringing the center of mass closer to the balance boundaries. The need for the lean forward decreases, reducing the load on our shoulders and making the movement mechanically more advantageous and more efficient. However, more compression requires more flexibility, hip flexor strength, and core engagement. So depending on your strengths and weaknesses, that's the trade-off to be made. I must make it explicit that the general consensus for a good press to handstand is considered the one that minimizes the lean forward and hence work required by compressing the body closer towards the center of mass line, making the movement more efficient and more elegant. A common misunderstanding is that compression is just a function of hip flexors, flexibility, and core. In order to compress something, we need at least two opposing forces. And in the case of the handstand press, one force is a combination of the hip flexion, flexibility, and core engagement, and another is a combination of shoulder flexion and scapular elevation. Both these forces are supported by the wrists and spinal extensors to create lift and ultimately press into the handstand. We have a section that focuses entirely on wrist preparation and conditioning in the foundation section of this course to get them strong for the press. When it comes to the spinal extensors, generally if you can bend and pick something up off the floor, you should be fine. But it's never a bad idea to work on your lower back to facilitate the press, so I have included some training for that as well in the foundation section of this program. That is all for now. I'm looking forward to see you in the next sessions.